Hello everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Chrysler Museum Glass Studio. My name is Robin Rogers. I'm the assistant manager here at the studio, and I'm going to be your narrator for the next hour or so. Has anyone been to our space before? Has anyone been in? Very good. Welcome. Welcome back. And have you all been across the street to the museum? Not yet. The museum is directly across the street. We have an incredible collection of art next door, from ancient art to contemporary art. We happen to have one of the nation's largest collection of glass, and that's why we exist here at the studio. Now the museum is totally free and open to the public, as is the Glass Studio Tuesday through Sunday. We here at the Glass Studio are part of the education department of the museum, and it's our mission to educate all of you about glass as a material and about how artists use that material to create. And we support this mission through demonstrations. So Tuesday through Sunday at noon, we do a free narrated demo, which you're currently attending. We also offer classes. So if this seems interesting, or any of the processes we do here seem interesting, you can come back and take classes here with us. These classes range from short little hour-and-a-half long sessions for 5 years old and up. If you want to learn more about the process, you can take a weekend-long class or even a week-long workshop. So all the course information is described in this catalog here. You can also find the information online at chrysler.org, and you can find these on the front desk on your way out. Now, it's a very special weekend here at our studio because just a few times a year, 3 or 4 times a year, we have what's called the Visiting Artist Series. And during this series, we bring in world-renowned glass artists to create their work here in front of you in our studio, and that's what's happening this weekend. Very, very lucky and thrilled to have working here today and all this weekend, Mr. Micah Evans. Would you help me in joining a round of applause to welcome him? So in the next hour or so, I'm going to be talking about and telling you about Micah and his career, and we're also going to talk about glass as a material, so hopefully you guys might learn something new about glass. And this particular process that he's doing is called flame working. There's a lot of different ways to work with glass. You can do stained glass, you can do what's called fusing and slumping, you can cast it like a lost wax process like you would cast bronze. You can do glass blowing, which takes place here using this equipment you see over here. And another process is what we see right here, flame working. So we'll be talking about all of these things in the next hour. Micah here is originally from Washington State. He started working with glass in about 1999. He grew up in the shadow of Mount St. Helens. And the work that he's working on over the next couple days has been influenced and inspired somewhat by topographical maps. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a topographical map, but they kind of look like this that you see here. This is actually a glass sculpture of a topographical map that he created. That sculpture's about this big, it's pretty large. So growing up in the mountains, he was interested in geology and topography, and you can see it's now influencing his artwork. He currently lives and works in Austin, Texas, but recently he spent, was it 4 years?
About 4 years.
About 4 years in the mountains of North Carolina near a little town called Spruce Pine, where he was a resident artist at the Penland School of Crafts. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Penland School of Crafts. It's an amazing place. They have all sorts of programmings to support artists there at all points in their career. And they have a residency program, and they have it for different artists that work in different medium. And they typically had a glass residency for a glass blower. Michael was actually the very first flame worker, a person that works on a torch like this, to have that residency. And when did that finish up?
I guess probably about 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago,
yep.
And he's been back in Austin since. And you were in Austin before Penland, too. So he shows his work around the world. He teaches around the world. And again, we're really thrilled and lucky to have him here with us today. So very quickly, I'm going to kind of bring you up to speed so you can understand exactly what he's doing out here. And then we'll go into some other specifics about glass. But the shape that he's working towards is a starling. He makes these glass starlings. Here's some drawings that he made for reference so that he's familiar with the shape. He's made over 100 of these in his career, although typically he made some in clear glass. So in the past he's made them in clear, and there's a story that goes along with them. I won't get into that quite yet. But again, going back to the topography, what he wanted to work on while he was here is creating these starlings. Is this going to fall out? Or?
Yeah, it will, but
I'll just pull it out real quick. This one he was working on yesterday. It's not quite finished. He's going to be able to heat it back up and continue working on it. But can you see the black lines that are all over this bird, referencing the topography that you see on the map? So that's what he's doing. Like I said, typically he makes these in clear. This is only the second one he's ever made that had some sort of patterning or color on it. So in order to make that complex color patterning, he has to do the process that he's currently doing. So all of those little bubbles that you see there in the wooden block, as well as the tube that you see him holding, all of those are going to come together to create another starling just like this, about the same size. Now this particular starling, and pretty much I think all the ones he makes, are clutching quarters. So while it was hot, he fit this quarter in there, and it'll eventually get glued in a little bit so that it won't fall out. But the story that he told us yesterday about this is when he was growing up, his neighbor's father had this immaculate cherry tree, Rainier cherries. If you're familiar with Washington State, then you know that it's home of many cherries and apples and onions and things like that. So this particular cherry tree would get some visitors. These starlings would come through and inevitably rob it of all his cherries right before his friend's father would harvest. So when they were young and they had BB guns, they would get hired by his friend's father to, shoot the starlings, and for every one they got, they would get paid a quarter. So when these are finished, he actually fills them with BBs, and I'll show you an image on the screen in a little bit. And he creates a kind of installation of them on the ground, clutching their quarters full of BBs, and kind of an interesting biography there, referencing his early life. And a lot of his work is inspired by memory and early experiences from his early life there in Washington, so on and so forth. So the way that he's created these black lines, actually let's just start at the beginning. So this process he's doing again is called flame working. That torch that he's working on is fueled with propane and oxygen. Propane by itself burns at about 1100, maybe 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, not hot enough to melt glass. When you add the oxygen, you get that blue flame, and it jumps up to about 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Quite hot, and plenty hot to melt glass. Now, there's a lot of different types of glass, and we'll get into some of these, talking about some of the different chemistry in a bit. But the type of glass he's using there is called borosilicate glass. And we purchase borosilicate glass in tubes like this. Okay, we buy it in these about 4-foot lengths. And then this is a pretty large and cumbersome thing to work with. So in order to work with the tubing, we bring it to the torch and we heat up a section. and then stretch it out. And the section that gets heated gets stretched down to be, thank you, much thinner. So you can see that this piece was stretched once, and then it was heated and stretched again to create this, which is called a point. And these little handles are nice because they're a thinner diameter, so it's much easier to turn. So with just a smooth motion across the fingers, you can turn it 3 or 4 full revolutions. Whereas if you were working with the whole tube, trying to turn it, you'd be going like this. Now the reason you have to turn glass while you're working on it, you're constantly turning it, is because when glass heats up, it starts to flow and move and respond to gravity. So if you weren't constantly turning the glass, it would be dripping off, right? And if you're trying to keep things symmetrical, like he's doing here, he's constantly turning. Okay? So that's where the tubing comes from, and that's how he gets to this point, literally. It's called a point. Now, to get these little black lines on there, well, who knows what glass is made of, or what the main ingredient of glass is? Sand. Yeah, silica sand. That's correct. There's many different types of glass, but they're all pretty much based on silica. Silica, soda ash, and lime is called soda lime glass. This glass, borosilicate glass, is silica plus boron and some other ingredients. That's clear glass, though. If you want colored glass, you add metal oxides to those raw materials. So if you were to add, let's say, cobalt oxide, anybody want to guess what color that would turn? Blue, cobalt blue, right? Probably heard of that before. And then there's a wide variety of different metal oxides and combinations of oxides that you can create colors with. So he has some black glass over here, and he's pulled it down into what we call stringer. These little fine, stretched out, solid black glass. Now, in order to make these little rings, it's a musical instrument. He could take the black glass and just draw rings around the tube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then melt it in. And he would get a similar effect to this, but the lines would be, as they melted into the tube, they would mix with the clear glass underneath, and they would get diluted a little bit, and they would bleed out, and the edges would not be super crisp and sharp. So instead of doing that, because he wants these lines to be very defined in order to reference the map. So what he's been doing is he takes this tubing and he breaks it apart in one spot. He wraps the lip of one side with the black, and then he puts them back together. So in actuality, the clear glass stops, black glass starts, clear glass stops, black glass starts. It's in between the clear. It's not on top of the clear. Does that make sense? So that is a very time-consuming process. He started just before 10 a.m. this morning and made what you see right here. So he's already 2 hours and 15 minutes into this starling, and it's all what we call prep work. Particularly with this style of working, there's a lot of preparatory work that goes into getting to an end result. So what he's doing at this point is he has all these different little spheres that he's made, and he's starting to put them together. And he's been experimenting with the best way to put these together to get the patterning that he wants to reference. Again, always coming back to this topography. Because he'll be adding some from different axes, and then you'll notice, so he's going to add this little one on, and then he's going to get the whole thing hot and basically bring it back together so it's a sphere again. It won't have this bump coming off the side, but the patterning is going to join the other patterning to go on to create the final patterning for the piece. Because eventually, he's going to basically put all these together to make one bubble that will then get shaped into the starling. Okay? Put this back here. And he's made a new attachment there. He's actually burning off the old attachment. So typically when he's working, it's sealed up. When you're working on a point like this, one end is sealed and one end is open so that as you're working, you can blow and inflate. Because not only is he shaping the glass with these little graphite and metal tools you see out here, but a lot of the shaping of the glass happens with gravity, with air pressure, and with just heat. Need some?
There's a
Some more 6? Okay.
Like at any point here.
Sure. Gail's got it. So, while we're on the topic of where the glass comes from and stuff, Micah was telling me, I've actually never seen this stuff created, but he went to a factory where they were making this, and it was about a 4-story building. And on the top floor of the building was the furnace. So the furnace is where all those raw materials that I described were being melted. Now you melt them, for this type of glass, you melt them, I think, about 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can imagine, so if you've ever seen our furnace, it's actually off now. This is where we melt our glass. We put the raw material in here, we heat it up to about 2,300 for our type of glass. It holds 500 pounds of glass, which seems like a lot of glass to me. But the furnaces at these sorts of facilities hold tons and hundreds of tons of glass. So we have a little bird bath full of molten glass. They have a swimming pool full of molten glass on the 4th floor, okay? Coming out of the bottom of that furnace is an orifice that's allowing a small stream of glass to pour out the bottom. It drops through that orifice, through some sort of die, which sets the diameter of the tube and the thickness of the tube, and it drops vertically 4 stories. And then at the very bottom, there's a person who's cutting it off and setting it down, cutting it off and setting it down in these 4-foot lengths. Because by the time it gets all the way down 4 stories, it's cooled off to the point that they can do that. And he said that these furnaces, once they build them and fire them up, they're around 24 hours a day and never, ever stop for about 3 years straight. And after about 3 years, glass in its molten state is extremely corrosive, and it eats through the walls of the furnace. Every furnace has a short lifespan because of the glass being so corrosive. So after about 3 years, they just scrap it. And he said that they have 2 buildings side by side, which are basically identical, but one has a furnace that's being built and getting ready to be used. And then when the other furnace is getting near the end of its life, they start heating up the other furnace and then just switch. So it basically never stops. It's just a constant flow of glass, it's a constant flow of the tubing. Now they make different size tubing, they can extrude solid rod in the same way, so on and so forth. But it's quite a process to get to this point. Now we could make a tube like this here in our studio, but we would have to, we would take a solid metal tube called a blowpipe. You would get some glass out of the furnace, gathering it out. We could make a bubble and stretch it out, but we would get one tube that's maybe 3 feet long, whereas this enormous factory is producing thousands of these a day. Now this type of glass, I mentioned it, it's borosilicate glass. You probably all have some borosilicate glass at home in your kitchen, I bet. You probably know it by its trade name, Pyrex. Ever heard of Pyrex glass? So Pyrex is Corning's trademark. There are other companies that make glass out of borosilicate glass, but like I mentioned, there's many different types of glass. They all have different properties, and they've all been designed to have these different properties. Pyrex glass, or borosilicate glass, has been designed to have a very, very low thermal shock point. So for instance, at home, you can bake brownies in it. You can put this glass dish in your oven, bake brownies, and bring it out. You could break it if you want. I'm sure you could bring it straight out of the oven, put water on it, and it probably would break. But it's harder to break than, let's say, the type of glass that bottles and jars and things are made out of. It's just soda lime glass like what we melt here. If you made a baking dish out of that type of glass, it would probably break as soon as you put it in the oven, because it just can't handle that quick temperature change, going from room temperature to 350 or 400 in a very short amount of time. So that's one of the beautiful things about this glass, and it makes Micah's life a little bit easier during this process, because he can take the tube and put it almost directly into the fire and not have it crack. So he could make this bird out of the soda lime glass, but he would have to heat it up much more slowly and be much more gentle the entire time with the heat. So it's one of the nice things about this particular material is being able to heat it up quickly like that. Now all glass, just like any other material on the planet, when it gets heated up, it physically expands a little bit. It actually grows. It's not a lot, but it grows a little bit. And that's where the cracking comes in. If you heat something up too quickly, the surface is expanding, but the center, the core, is not expanding. Stress is building up and it breaks. And then the same thing happens in reverse. If you cool it off too quickly, the surface cools and shrinks, but the core doesn't. Stress builds up and it breaks. So typically, and if you've ever seen one of our hot glass demonstrations over here, when we're making something, we're keeping the entire thing above 900 degrees the whole time, and then when we finish it, we remove it, we place it into a kiln, and we cool it slowly to room temperature. And the thicker the glass is, the slower we cool it. It's all based on its thickness. This type of glass, being more thermally shock resistant, he can actually allow this thing to cool all the way down to room temperature, and it probably won't crack as long as it's been constructed well. But there's still stress inside the glass, and it could crack at any moment. So even these objects need to go through that slow cooling process. So at a later date, and really the sooner the better, as soon as he finishes making it, we'll put it into a kiln, heat it up to 1,500 degrees, that's the annealing point of this type of glass, and then cool it slowly. Annealing is the process of relieving the stress in the glass and then cooling it slowly from there. Okay, so again, he's continuing with the assembly here. I think he learned a little bit from yesterday's, the way he put the bubbles together, and he might be trying it slightly different, to get that desired effect. Do you guys have any questions at this point? And if you do at any point, just get my attention and I'll answer them for you. If you have questions directly for Micah, he might be able to answer them, or at the end of the demonstration, he'll be willing to take some questions. I want to, very quickly, I'm going to bring up some images of some of his other work on the screen. I have a little slideshow that's playing, and it's going to roll through some images. Let's see if I can do this. This is a decanter. He makes these really elaborate decanters. Those are some more decanters. Is there special properties to what they do to what they're decanting?
Yeah, they make things
They make everything taste better, right?
10% better, guaranteed.
They like aerate.
Aerate, yeah.
Yeah.
Which may or may not make it.
They're beautiful pieces. This is a sculptural form. Few sculptural forms on here, and then you'll see there is a slide of the starlings that I was describing with the BBs inside, clutching the quarters. And these decanters with those rings are kind of similar to what he's doing here. That's a grub, or a caterpillar, sorry. There's the starlings. And you saw there's a sewing machine that's on the slideshow. There's also this sewing machine on the poster, Micah's poster here. He was telling us about this sewing machine yesterday. Robert, would you hand me one more of these posters so I can walk around? This is a piece that he made when he was at Penland as the visiting artist. It took over 300 hours to create this. It's a replica of a 1889, what was it?
Yep.
What was the make of the sewing machine?
Wilcox and Gibbs.
Wilcox and Gibbs. So he had the actual sewing machine that he was taking measurements off of, making drawings from, and he spent about 300 hours making this entirely by hand. So each one of these curves was made individually, for instance, and then assembled, and every single part was very meticulously fabricated and assembled. Is it currently on view?
No.
Not yet. It will be on view in the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's part of the Smithsonian. It's their contemporary craft museum. So you can look for this someday when next time you're up in D.C. The purple glass in this piece is really an interesting type of glass. Do you know how they make that, Micah?
Absolutely not.
They put some magical metal oxides in there to get that color. Does it change color?
A little bit.
Is it a phase shift? There's some types of glass color that when you put them, for instance, in fluorescent light or incandescent light, they look very different. Like they'll go from a greenish to a pink.
Neodymium.
Neodymium, is that what they add into it?
One of them.
One of the colors. So I'm going to switch back to the live feed from his slideshow here, but you can find Micah's work online. You can Google search for his name. He does have a website, but it's currently under construction, is that right?
Yeah, rebuilt. Yep.
Being rebuilt. So we're going to go back to camera 2. So you'll notice this torch has a large flame and it has a small flame. Because sometimes he needs a lot of fire and sometimes not so much. And there's a foot switch, which you may hear him kind of clicking down below. And the switch, you can see that both of his hands are pretty occupied. So the switch enables him to go from that large flame to the small flame. And again, what he's working on looks pretty kind of interesting as a sculptural form right now, but the shape that it's in right now has nothing to do with what it's going to be. It's just getting that color patterning. So he has this sort of part that's protruding off here with the several little bumps. He's going to keep heating all those and basically blowing it all together so it's one sphere. An interesting thing about this process is if you've ever tried a class here with us, you find out that if to control the glass is to control its temperature. Glass is only going to move when it's hot. It's only going to change shape when it's hot. And also, if you've shaped an area and you like how it is and you get it too hot, you can lose detail and, you know. So controlling temperature is really the name of the game. Working in this process with this sort of torch gives you a lot of control over the temperature because you can use the big flame to get a whole bunch hot at once. You can use the small flame to very specifically heat one area. So it's an incredible tool for the glass artist to be able to heat so specifically. And this little torch he's using, again, it's an oxygen propane torch, but the little hand torch gives him even more accuracy and control, so he can come in and heat just the smallest area possible. That specific torch, that little torch, glass workers have adopted from jewelry. It's a jeweler's torch, commonly used by goldsmiths. How about now? You guys have any questions? Just covering it all? If you go next door into our collection, we have some objects on view that are flame work, this process, although not too many. We do have a piece over there by Luke Jerem that's it's actually a virus that's been blown up several hundred times and sculpted in glass. If you've ever seen that piece, it's a flame worked piece made of this borosilicate glass. We have some sculptural glass made by Lucio Bubacco, who's an Italian maestro. We also have the chess set. Have you guys seen the chess set over there? It's a really beautiful piece by Gianni Toso. That is also created using this flame working process, although those figurines are all solid glass or solid sculpted, whereas this form is completely hollow. I'll just say everything he's doing out here, he's making look extremely easy. Yes?
So how
So he started in 1999. And did you start in Washington or when you were in Florida?
In Seattle, Washington.
In Seattle, yeah. So I think he told me that he found a shop. How old were you when you started hanging out at that shop?
About 24.
When he was about 24, he found a studio that he was fascinated in and was hanging out there quite a bit. And he was drawing a lot, right? You were doing more 2D art. And the people in the shop felt like, well, he was being creative and making his own art, and so that's fine. So they let him hang out. And then at some point they put glass in your hand. Is that what happened?
Pretty much.
At some point they brought him into the fold. A lot of people ask, like, how did you get your start? And 99% of glass artists have pretty much the exact same story, which is I saw it, I tried it, and then I couldn't stop. And now it's 20 years later, and it's my life. Because it's just such a captivating process, the allure of the molten material, the way it moves, the way it flows. I know for myself, and I think for Micah and other glass artists as well, the process is what it's really all about. Like, the final product is beautiful, it's interesting, looks good, but it's more about this process of making that keeps me coming back, because there's so much you can do with the material that you just keep coming up with new ideas, like, well, try this, and then the material accommodates. It's really amazing.
It's working really well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it looks, the patterning looks a little different than yesterday's.
Yeah.
So when we invite artists like Micah here to work in our studio, we want them to show you their process for sure, but we also want them to be able to experiment and maybe try new things. And we're really thrilled that that's what he's doing here. He's never really created this patterning before in this way. Did you see that? So this is the nature of glass. Even though it's borosilicate glass and it's thermally shock resistant, it's not thermally shock indestructible. So that bubble went into the flame and it was just a little unhappy. There was a little stress in it and it kind of popped and broke apart. We get so used to the sound of breaking glass in here. In fact, I love the sound of breaking glass. It's not uncommon though to spend hours on a piece and then have it develop a crack or have it simply fall off and hit the floor. And it's actually I'm not wishing this on you, Micah, but sometimes it makes a great, some of the better demos. When we get right towards the end of the demo and then the whole thing hits the floor and the audience gasps and like, oh, and they feel so bad for the artist, and the artist is like, no big deal, going to lunch. The material really, it's full of a lot of lessons, life lessons, like how to let go and how to not count your chickens before they hatch, because you never know. Even if it goes into the kiln and it seems good, and you're like, oh good, it went away, sometimes the next day you bring it out, it could be cracked. Now, one of the beautiful things about this material versus what we do in the hot shop is if it is cracked, a lot of times you can heat it back up and fix it, which is pretty nice. It's a little harder to do in the blown glass. There's the Hubble telescope. Are you familiar with the Hubble telescope and that lens? The first time they made that lens, I'm not sure the year, but it was cast glass.
Borosilicate.
Cast borosilicate. It's huge. They cast the glass, they annealed it, they cooled it down slowly for over a year. They opened the kiln after that year and there was a huge crack running through it and they had to start all over. And that's the nature of the material. So I mentioned that there were a lot of different types of glass, and I've told you about borosilicate, and I've told you about soda lime. The soda lime is what's in bottles and jars, and windows is probably the most common type of glass. Some other types of glass are lead crystal. You've probably heard of lead crystal. When people talk about or have crystal in their home, like the fine crystal, That's typically what they're talking about. It's not, has nothing to do with quartz crystal. It's just a term for very, very optically clear glass, and typically it's made by using lead as the flux. That type of glass melts at a slightly lower temperature, and it's actually a little softer, and it's great for cutting and engraving upon. So again, you may have heard of the Waterford crystal, for instance, from Ireland, where they cut the glass and make the brilliant patterns and so on and so forth. So a lot of microscope lenses and camera lenses and things like that are made using lead crystal for that optical quality. Yes?
Do you have a specific image in mind or specific pattern?
Yeah, he has a very specific image in mind. So what he's creating, it'll be a starling just like this. And he, of course, he's made over 100 of these birds in the past, but it's always good to have some reference. So he did some drawings of the bird. Some he makes with the open mouth, some are closed mouth. Typically, they're all dead, clutching quarters in their hands. For the patterning? Oh, yeah. Is this, so I can tell you that the one on the poster that you see down here is based on a very specific place. And he told us yesterday that he lived right about here.
Finland, yeah.
That's the hill at Finland where he did the residency. So this one is referencing a very specific location. As far as the piece you're working on right now?
No, I'm just, it goes alongside a piece that has a very specific location, but this is just kind of referencing.
It's just kind of referencing the pattern, but this is not a super specific location. Although maybe in the future you could.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Perfect waste of time. I love that.
Yeah.
It's right up my alley.
So he says that he uses these maps, for instance, to kind of capture and talk about memories and times of his life and things like that. One more?
One more.
He's going to add one more, and again, kind of bring it together. And then at that point, he's going to start heating the whole bubble and starting to shape out the bird form. Yes?
The tool he's using to put the holes in.
Yeah.
Like something attached to a pencil.
Yeah, it is attached to a pencil.
I know, it's hilarious. It's just graphite.
It's a graphite reamer. It just happens to be on a pencil. It's not the graphite from the pencil, but it's has an octagonal shape and it's tapered down. He's using it to widen the hole. The hole actually comes from, you'll see he uses the little torch, and then he blows, and with air pressure it pops a hole open, and then he can use the reamer to open it to the diameter that matches the diameter of the end of the little sphere that he has there. So this type of glass and this process really has a lot of roots in scientific glass making. This is a piece of scientific apparatus made of Pyrex or borosilicate. This is a condenser. But you can see there's a tube inside, another tube. It would enable someone to run either a liquid or a gas through the inner tube with a different liquid or gas in the outer jacket. So for instance, you could super cool that liquid or heat it without having direct contact with another material. Condensers are often used in stills for making alcohol and things like that. But the Pyrex, because of the thermal shock resistance, has a long history in scientific apparatus, and it's only really much more recently being used as an artist material. I mean, since what? The 80s?
Yeah. Well, I mean, by 70s.
The 70s.
Carnival glass.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, so as he's blowing, you can see it's kind of popping out, and he just poked a hole by, when it was hot, blowing a little harder, and it just popped open. And that's the flame whistling like when you blow across a bottle. Here's a condenser coil inside there. So he's made an attachment down there, which means he's probably going to take one of the other handles off. If you've ever seen a hot glass demonstration that we do over here when we're blowing, we have these long metal tubes and metal rods. We have various different scissors and a big pile of tools and tweezers and different things like that. And we use so many different tools. One of the things I find interesting about this process is there's very little tools, like metal-wise. He's got the little reamer that he's been using, but a lot of the tools are just the glass itself. So like this connection here is on a rod of glass, and the glass itself becomes a tool. Now one thing that's interesting, or another thing that's interesting about this material of glass, is notice that where it's glowing, where he's heating it with the torch, it's above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But he's barehanded, he's not wearing gloves or anything like that. So there's certain materials on this planet that are conductors. They conduct things like electricity and heat. And there's other things on the planet that are insulators, which kind of do the opposite of conducting. So an incredible conductor is, or can anyone name a conductor? Copper, right? It's the best, one of the best. It conducts electricity through our wires. If you have a length of copper this big and you heat it up on one end, you're gonna feel the heat pretty soon. It's gonna travel down to your hand. Glass being the opposite of that, I can take a little rod. I can get it molten in the flame. So I'm going to heat the rod to the point that it's glowing on the end. Over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see it's glowing. So that's still 1,800 right now. I can bring my hand. I'm just starting to feel the heat right there. So that 2,000 degrees of heat only traveled less than an inch up the rod. So it's a really incredible insulator. It's why we insulate our homes with fiberglass. And I'm sure you've had thermoses that have a glass liner, so on and so forth. There's just so many fascinating properties of glass. So at this point, he's put all the bubbles together. This is going to be all the color patterning he wants for this piece. And he has a slightly larger tube here. We're going to call that the blow tube. Because he's been working on these little thin points, right? We talked about the point, the stretched out glass. And now that he has them all together, he could continue working on those points, but since it's quite a bit of weight, and he's going to be heating it up and kind of pressing on it and shaping it, it's likely that the point could break, and that's never good because it breaks in your hand. You could get cut or the piece could fall and break. So what he's going to do is attach this thicker tube, which we can call the blow tube, to the bottom here where he's created that hole. And you can see the bird from yesterday is attached to this thicker tube. Okay, so starting now, we'll be able to start to watch the bird take a little more shape. And the place that he's connected there, is that going to be on the bottom of the tail, or are you going to switch it again?
Not quite sure yet.
So he's not sure. It could end up here, But right now the blow tube could be actually where the head is or anything else.
So now the trick is turning this back into a cylinder.
A regular shape, yeah.
Like
So he's gonna, the trick he says is to now turn this kind of funky oblong shape back into something uniform, ideally a uniform thickness and shape. And so he started at a little before 10 and it's now 12:45. So the first 2 hours and 45 minutes have been just creating the color patterning for the piece. Yesterday, this piece, he worked till 1 and then he worked several hours in the afternoon on it to get to this point. And he's still going to do some more work on that one.
Do the colors burn hotter than the clear, or is it just because we
Yeah,
can see?
that's a great question. She says, do the colors burn hotter than the clear? Great observation. You can see them, they do glow more or in a different way than the clear. And every color is orange, by the way, when it's hot. But they behave differently. Depending on what metal oxides are in there, they might heat up faster, they might cool off more quickly. They might respond to certain types of flames. For instance, there's colors that if you use a flame that has a little more propane than oxygen, the colors will turn metallic. It's called reducing because it's kind of the opposite of oxidation, the opposite of rusting. So yeah, the colors all behave differently, which means as he heats and expands this, he needs to be careful that it doesn't, trying to get that uniform shape is the challenge because it does want to move differently where it has different amounts of color. And by having when he has it attached on both sides like he just did, he'll be able to get the whole thing hotter because he's supporting it from both sides. When he's just connected on one side, you can only heat it up so much before it wants to fall off. And then you may notice he's had it on, maybe, no, not yet. He's got this tube, see this rubber tube around his neck that's going to the glass blow tube. That will enable him to add air pressure. So and at this point, really not a lot of air pressure because that glass is quite hot. So he's just giving it little tiny puffs of air, but inflating it nonetheless. And he's also, if you notice, it was about this big. It's getting smaller. He's condensing it. He's thickening the glass up. To make the starling, he's going to need a certain amount of thickness there. But just simply because of how he constructed it, currently there's a lot of areas that are thicker and thinner, and so it's challenging, yeah. Yeah. Getting the perfect roast on the marshmallow and then, just before it catches on fire. Yeah. But it melts the chocolate, yeah.
I'm stealing that. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, in order to do this, it's kind of interesting because he spent all this time making this bubble, but he has to actually get it close to the point that it's going to collapse on itself. And in an instant, it could be like, well, it's over. But in order to get it to melt down and condense like that, he has to kind of push the envelope and let it start to collapse on itself. This little pad is made of graphite. We call it a marver. We have these large metal tables in the studio that we roll the glass on. They're also marvers. So the graphite pad that he was just rolling on enables him to help, again, get a nice uniform shape on the outside there. Graphite's a really great material for working with glass. It's so smooth, it doesn't mar the glass in any way or leave a mark behind. It also doesn't burn. You can get graphite very, very hot. Eventually it starts to get brittle if it's too hot. One more?
One, just to switch sides that I'm blowing on, finish out the cylinder on the other. Yeah, one more.
He's going to add one more little bit of color there on the end. So one other fascinating thing about glass, I mentioned the glass is a conductor. Or, I mean, it's an insulator, it's not a conductor. But glass actually is a conductor when it's hot. Does anybody know that? When glass is molten, when it's above 2,000 degrees, it conducts electricity, which is really fascinating. And then as the temperature cools, the resistance builds up, and then pretty soon it's not a conductor, and then pretty soon it's one of the greatest insulators on the planet.
Why is that? Like, what's happening to the electrons when they go through the glass when it's hot? They can like skate down the trail, or how does that?
Why?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I don't know why, but I've witnessed it firsthand. In fact, one of our instructors here, who's doing a performance next Thursday, James Akers, plays with this a lot in his work. He'll take molten glass and pour it out, and he'll put 2 electrodes in it, and then based on the current as it's flowing through the glass, he turns that into a sound. And as the resistance builds up, the sound changes. So he's kind of illustrating the buildup of resistance and the switch from conductivity to insulator, translating that kind of into sound, which is pretty interesting. Has anyone ever been to one of our third Thursday performances? Heard of that? So we had one just 2 nights ago featuring Micah Evans down here. So what these are, as I mentioned, we try to cover as many processes of using glass over here in the studio, be it stained glass or flame working or glass blowing. But we also, we didn't invent this here, but we do a lot of performance glass, and it's something that we have kind of identified ourselves as a studio as doing. And each month we have these series where we sometimes bring in artists, sometimes we do them in-house, but we use glass in new and different ways that typically don't result in an object. It's more about what happens that evening, it's more about the moment, and it's about experiencing the glass in its molten state. And they're all very, very different. We've had some that are more almost dance related, where people are more dancing and there's molten glass involved. We've had more dramatic ones. We had the core theater group come in and act scenes from the Glass Menagerie while a glass unicorn was being made, which was smashed at the end, because if you're familiar with the Glass Menagerie, the unicorn breaks. So they're all very different, very interesting. We had a lot of fun the other night. We were exploring Micah's topography, only instead of using glass, we were using these threads, so we could build it much more quickly, but we were using glass tripods to raise and lower the threads to create a topography. And then, you know, typically at the end there's some sort of finale where we cut all the strings and all the glass fell and broke and made beautiful sound on the floor. So they're really interesting evenings. They're free to museum members. It's $5 for everyone else. There's a bar, we have live music, and it's a fun time. So if you ever want to check one out, I recommend it. I will say that they're very popular and we always hit capacity. You can actually get tickets online, I think about a week before the event, they become available. The doors open at 8 o'clock. On the day of the event, you can come here and get a ticket at 6 p.m. starting at 6. So if you show up at 8, there's a chance you might not be getting in. If you show up at 6 on the day of, you should be pretty good. Did you have a question? If you go to our website, Chrysler.org, we have a whole archive of previous performances here. And we have an incredible photographer, videographer, who's actually standing right back there, Mr. Eckert Wheeler. And Eckert captures all of them for us, and he edits into a 3-minute long, because we know everyone's attention span, right? It's 3 minutes in a video, which capture some of these events. And so check them out if it sounds interesting. The one from Micah's probably a few weeks out. It takes him some time to edit it, and then we post them up there.
So I'm gonna have just enough time to kind of shape out what is the initial body of this before we get our.
Can we walk that around one time?
Yeah. Let me,
Need a flash. So I'm gonna bring this around real quick, or maybe Micah will, and then he's gonna shape out the basic body. But as he comes around, you can see the patterning. It's really beautiful.
Just getting a heat to soak in so I can walk it around a little bit and it won't cool off too much. But it's going to be hot, so.
Yeah, don't touch.
It's kind of neat to see the transition from that orange as it starts to cool off. Yeah. Back to the black. But it's a lot of work to do a little pattern.
Yeah, that's what.
Anything I can do is not making work.
Question, everything?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's that? You saw smoke? Where? Oh, when he was burning the color. Yeah, where's that come from, Micah?
It's kind of that last when the color separates, you know? It's,
I've seen it before, but I don't know
Yeah.
what's actually burning.
that's hopefully what I could do.
So he's going to work on this bubble a little bit more here, and then we're going to be taking lunch before too long. This afternoon, he'll continue shaping out the bird. Do you guys have any questions at this moment?
Is it doing what you wanted it to do right now?
As far as the pattern, yeah, it's all kind of a grand experiment, but I'm trying to get those lines to change from that very radial exact starting point, you know, the very simple clean line. And when I assemble them all together in that ball, I do it in a way that when it's re-stretched out to this point, that they all get disrupted and pushed and curved. And then that gets accentuated even more as I start to shape it and sculpt it into that bird. So I think this is definitely closer to what I was envisioning than the first shot, but I think they're both successful. I'm just interested in seeing how much control and I can gain over those lines. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever be able to put an exact topography, considering the unpredictable nature of the process. But I think I'll get very close to giving a kind of a. Hopefully, I'll get to a point where I won't have to tell somebody that it's referencing topography.
I think when you put it next to a piece like that, that'll inform. Did you figure out which side the head's going to be on yet?
Yeah, it's going to be this side right here.
So the spot he's heating will be the head or the top. One thing I haven't mentioned is the really cool glasses that Micah's wearing. They look like pretty sweet sunglasses. They have a special coating on them. It's called didinium. It has 2 rare earth minerals. And when he puts that glass in the flame, it looks pretty bright to us, right? We're kind of seeing spots. Those spots will go away momentarily. But if you were to do this every day as your career, you wouldn't want to be looking at that bright light. In fact, it's really hard to see what's happening in the flame. Those glasses and those rare earth minerals take that flare away so that in the flame he can see exactly what's happening and where the heat is going. So he's heating up that whole middle section. That's basically going to be the abdomen. And as he's blowing a little bit, you can see that bird form is actually starting to emerge. Yeah.
With those glasses, I know you know what you're doing, and you tell the intensity of the color.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to explain when you don't have that reference, but all I see is the glass and the blue flame. None of those all those reds and oranges that you see are gone. And so it's cutting out any sort of interference that would give you. So I'm seeing even when it's in the flame, I can see everything that's going on with the material. And it even dulls that red that the black puts off. So, the darker shades, that's why the lenses are so dark. It's to cut out the reflection of the heat on those darker colors.
All right, so there's the basic shape of the bird. He's going to put this into a kiln. The kiln's at 1050 degrees. That's cold for the glass. It's not moving or changing shape in there, but it's just staying happy with itself and it's not cracking.
So you can see the differences of kind of what I did yesterday and how much pattern there was, and then what I've done today is really, I noticed this guy on the back, how that not only looked, but how it displaced the lines around it, and I tried to really amp that up a little bit.